The plan by government to enforce a policy to regulate religious organizations has set off a combustible contest amongst faith-based groups. Amongst a raft of proposals to be included in the draft policy, faith-based outfits are expected to be registered, train their pastors in theological doctrine, and have a cordial relationship with government. For instance, if cabinet adopts the policy, districts will have religious and faith-based organization boards. They shall be composed of 3 political leaders and 4 technical officers. The committee shall have powers to co-opt technical officers to deal with specific issues. In the view of the state, some pastors, especially in the Pentecostal church, are purveyors of a false gospel and manipulate their flock by faking miracles. And when religion is at its extreme, according to the framers of this policy, it manifests into a potent form of fanatism. Citing Uganda's troubled past, the exponents of this policy claim unregulated religion has offered breeding grounds for cults such as Joseph Kibwetere's, where the leader and his acolytes on March the 17th, 2000, locked believers in a church in Kanungu that was incinerated in a fire, resulting into the death of over 700 people. However, Pastor Michael Chaze of Omega Healing Center says this should be a primary role of intelligence and crime detection.
In every bunch, there are people who are evil, just like there are negative foreign influences within political leaders. That is a work of intelligence and police. And we think they are endowed with laws and they are given tools and they are trained to sniff out any criminals. So I do not think that also warrants a religious policy.
Those against the enforcement of this policy are choosing the state over attempting to regulate the freedom of worship, which is an inherent right. They fear that the creeping hand of the state into regulating religious affairs could be based on the rise of charismatic Pentecostal preachers who have rejected to toe the line of the unwritten credo. For long, the Pentecostal church has been an appendage of the regime. According to critics, in the clientele patronage politics, pliant Pentecostal pastors have offered glowing prophecies in favor of the NRM and its leaders.
Thing is hatched and it is supposed to be applied selectively. Even the whole thing of, requirements of this and that, of, theological training and all that, I can assure you that nobody is going to be taken out of practice for not having a theological diploma or degree if they toe the government line. This is all politics.
The Pentecostal church's clout extends to the seat of power, that some of its leaders influence job appointments and others are given coveted roles in government. In the last population census carried out in 2014, the Pentecostal church registered the biggest growth between the years of 2002 to 2014. For instance, between 2002 to 2014, the numbers of the Catholic Church, which is the largest denomination, fell from 41.6% to 39.3%. The Anglican Church, the second largest church, registered a decline from 36.7% to 32%, while the Muslim faith grew slightly from 12.4% to 13.7%. Some of the Pentecostal pastors offer a different message from the traditional church that usually sticks to doctrinal theory. There fears that with the rise of emboldened pastors who preach a message of fire and brimstone at the pulpit, the state might gradually begin to lose a firm grip on the Pentecostal church. Pentecostal churches have previously been registered under the Trustees Incorporation Act and supervised by the Internal Affairs and Justice Ministries. However, the National NGO Policy of 2010 has recommended that faith-based organizations, which until now have been obliged to register as NGOs, shall not fall under the ambit of the NGO policy. Many of these faith-based outfits, which were registered under the NGO Act prior to the establishment of the policy, have been deregistered recently. If the policy is adopted, churches will be placed under the docket of the Ethics Ministry. The leading exponent of this campaign, a former Catholic priest and ethics minister, Father Simon Lokodo, says the policy will largely target churches that are keen on manipulating their flock.
Extortion, exploitation, demand, and all those things put together. And then bad guidance, where I'm told some of my pastors tell to their faithful, go and sell everything you have and come, God will bless you. They even go and encourage separation of families. These are very unacceptable things. They tell people not to go to receive scientific treatment for their sicknesses because they say God will do everything.
He also emphasized the need of theological training.
So for purposes of proper church organization and management, we need to be trained. That does not negate the fact that people are called by God, it's true, but there is needed to be well organized and do things that are pertinent, that meet the needs of the people, the community to which God calls us to go, as preachers, as pastors, whichever title one would like to choose.
To learn, right? You cannot go and become a teacher, jumping out from nowhere, and you start going to do the course of teaching. You first of all must have the elementary. You do your primary, which gives you the basis. You give the secondary, which gives you the some apprehension capacity, and then you go for your expertise. In Europe, the minimum is 7 years of education in the basic. Then you go for your branch, career making. That's what we want.
Because there are some who believe that they need to be directly linked with God. Religious organizations, which are African religious organizations, they rely on oral tradition. They rely on direct spiritual contact. They do not run schools. They don't have universities. How is he going to train those? If the document is segregative and it is targeting a certain religious group, say Pentecostals, then they are talking about the Pentecostal doctrine. We believe that the calling comes first, then the training later. Whoever Jesus worked with, he first called them to be with him, then he trained them. And most of them, St. Peter, St. Paul, were trained on the job.
The draft policy also recognizes self-regulation. The Director of Religious Affairs in the Ethics Ministry, Reverend Aaron Mwesigye, told NTV that the policy is not meant to enforce a harsh regulation and police faith-based organizations, but will largely set guidelines for effective operation.
A day policy. In other words, it's not the Directorate for Ethics and Integrity policy. It is not a government policy. It is the religious and faith-based organizations policy. Government is only playing a part of facilitation. We are facilitating the development of a plan. You know, a policy is our plan that will put what the minister called standard or the guidelines. I think that's the right word. Actually, policy sets guidelines that will set guidelines for effective operation. Let me give you an example. If you want to start a church under Pentecostal, or you want to start a mosque under Muslims, what should be the parameters? What should be the ABC on ground?
Pastor Michael Chaze accuses the government of intruding on the space of freedom of worship to validate and control faith-based outfits. He cited the areas of concern in the proposed policy, which he argues requires compliance to the whims and fancies of the regime.
In our bad eye view, what we see is we see government trying to become the supervisor and overseer of religious faiths. We are seeing government mixing politics with religion.
The passion from religion any more than you can remove it from sport, then what's the point? So as people are supposed to go to a stadium dressed in ties and what, and clap their hands like that. So religion without fanatism is dead. You have to be passionate. You have to be a fanatic, believe those things strongly, and not everybody is going to go down that path. Some people actually despise it. But then you cannot say that people should not go down that path, because that is what it is all about.
The intention of the law really is to push the born agains to be under a sort of a structure setup, which is termed as the RFO board under that proposed law, which will really constitute of a couple of political leaders like the RDC, DISO. You'll have I think the person from you'll have the DISO, RDC, you'll have somebody from the president's office and a few representatives of the born again faith. So it intends to push the born agains into some sort of structurally existent framework which is recognized by law, and as such they can then be muzzled by the government.
Joseph Kabuleta, who is a pastor with the Watchman Ministries, has already tested the wrath of the state. Earlier on in August this year, he was detained on charges of offensive communication under Section 25 of the Computer Misuse Act. He regained his freedom 4 days after his arrest. Beyond the narrow traditional space, which often recedes at the whims and fancies of the regime, cyberspace has handed a potent weapon to those with a craft to take on the state on subjects deemed uncomfortable to debate in the public. That is what Kabuleta, a former sports journalist, exploited. He believes that the policy will be selectively enforced to muzzle critical voices.
Now, why is it of consequence now as we are heading into an election? Everybody knows that. So as long as people do not let themselves be deceived by the marketing of this heinous law, that it's to curb excesses, people are being taken advantage of and all that, and they actually go to the nitty-gritty of it and look at what the draft policy says, only then can they make sober judgment. But the thing is, so many people are looking at what they are being fed, and they are being fed a completely different story from what is being propagated here by the people pushing for the policy.
Do you believe, in your view, Simon Ssenyonga says the policy is a choreographed ploy to bring certain sections of faith-based organizations on their knees. He cited a recent incident where the Criminal Intelligence and Investigations Directorate accused Prophet Elvis Mbonye for decampaigning immunization, which Ssenyonga says was a trumped-up charge.
The fear for the supernatural is actually much more for the people who are in the because they can't explain it. Because if you're just going to do the usual thing of singing mass and celebrating mass, it's somehow well known, it's well crafted. But where something is not conventional and you cannot calculate what will be the impact or the collateral damage that it would cause in case it's allowed to exist, then the best thing you can do is to curtail them or unfairly limit them, and then subsequently derogate the freedom of worship.
Yusuf Serunkuma, a researcher, says the policy could be premised on the fear that some pastors are manipulating their flock.
General concern. So one could argue that the government has registered this concern and now they're responding. There should be a legal framework within which faith-based organizations execute their mandate, execute their freedom. So there should be regulation, and I think that's the spirit. It could be argued that that's the spirit of the bill. Right, so that's part A. There's also need to regulate faith-based organization, right? Because the church and the state have often had a sort of a difficult relationship, because the church has potential to stand with the people, has potential to mobilize a sizable mass.
Where government thinks that it is the controller of what is good and right, what is good and bad doctrine, or what is correct and incorrect doctrine. Who gives them that responsibility? Faith is a very personal, sacred, sacrosanct thing between a person and what they believe and who they believe in. Now that cannot be policed unless that person breaks an existing law. You cannot police somebody's faith.
One of the key contestations is about the provisions under Chapter 4 of the Constitution in regard to the freedom of worship. Whereas there's a right to freedom of religion, there's a limitation in Article 43 of the Constitution. However, there's also a limitation that provides that any exemption to the rights and freedoms must demonstrably be justified under a free and democratic society. According to the draft policy, it is informed by other laws that are applicable in the work, coordination, and regulation of religious organizations, and they include the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Anti-Corruption Act, the Marriage Act, and the Public Management Act, as well as other relevant sectoral policies. However, some view this policy as symptomatic of the regime's attempt to curtail freedoms through licensing the media, film, and NGO sectors. The state and the church are strange bedfellows, some will argue. When the church becomes critical of the state, it becomes resentful, and when the church is compliant, usually the ties with the state are cordial. Emmanuel Mutaizibwa, NTV.